He came to the autumn fair, empty-handed, eyes cold, and left without buying a thing, not even the widowed woman selling herself for the price of a sack of cornmeal. Folks said Marshall Riker had lost it all. His wife buried, his ranch gone to weeds, his heart dried up like a summer trough left out in the sun. He didn't gamble, didn't drink, didn't buy a single item, not a rope, not a hen, not even the trembling hands of a woman cast out of the church, now standing there selling her very name in quiet desperation. On what should have been a fated day, he simply stood before the stall with a crude sign that read, "Will do anything, child comes with," then turned away without a word. But weeks later, on an afternoon soaked in red dust and silence, that same woman knocked on his door. One hand held a sack of cornmeal, the other a wooden spoon, and behind her stood a child who never once asked, "Where are we?" Late autumn, Nevada territory. The cold had seeped into the ground, a stretch of land where folks either passed through or chose in silence never to leave. The autumn wind slipped through the cracks of the old wooden door like rough fingers fumbling through memory. It crept along the weathered walls, rustled the faded grass out front, then circled the roof, once a bustling freight post, now reduced to the sigh of loose shutters tapping with each gust. Marshall Keene sat still in a wooden chair tucked close to the window, his body angled toward a stove that hadn't yet warmed. The collar of his shirt peeked out from a worn wool sweater with threadbare shoulders. His hands cupped a tin mug of cold coffee, but he didn't drink. To the outside eye, he might have seemed like a man simply watching the darkening dusk roll into the hollow. But up close, anyone would have seen the vast emptiness in his gaze, wider than the hills beyond, where light dissolved into rock and dust and never came back. The house wasn't large, but everything had once been placed just right. On the wall hung a faded woman's coat, soft cotton slumped like a memory left unfinished. Beside it, an unused hook. The stove, long neglected, now only served to roast potatoes or warm up canned soup. White porcelain dishes sat stacked in the cupboard, rims cracked but never discarded. The old dog, Buck, lay curled near the back door, its left leg twitching when the wind howled. Its coat, once white, had dulled to match the dirt floor and road dust, like even the dog had learned to fade so as not to take up too much space in a house already too quiet. On the table sat a letter with yellowed corners. The ink, once blue, had long faded, but the crease lines still held. It was from Marshall's mother, written in a year when winter stretched nearly 6 months. She had written, "Don't let this house shut like your heart. It's not the cold that kills, son. It's the silence no one dares to break." Marshall had read it a dozen times. The last was just a month ago, when the wind changed direction and the stove fire crackled in that uneasy way, like it too wanted to remind him. Winter was coming again. That smoke-heavy afternoon, Marshall didn't fix the horse stall as planned. Instead, he walked out behind the ranch, once the delivery stop, now overtaken by weeds and shattered bottles. He lifted a rotting board. Beneath it, an old sign with fading letters, "Hollow Rock Stop, Water and Provisions." Then he sat, right there on the steps, watching the sun split into streaks of orange across the far mountains. On the small table beside him sat an open can of beans, untouched. His boots were cracked at the ankles, but he still brushed the dust off them each morning. Not for anyone, just because his hands still remembered how to care for things no longer new, but once important. People in town still spoke of him with that uneasy blend of pity and dismissal. "That fella? Ex-soldier, lost his wife, lives with a gimpy dog. Don't drink, don't talk, don't bother no one. Then they moved on, the way folks pass old graves, nodding, but never stopping. Marshall knew he didn't blame them. Some days he too felt like a shadow no longer made to shield from sun, only remembered when someone needed to point to something that once was. In front of him lay a sheet of rough paper and a stub of pencil. On it, he had scrawled a few trial lines, something he meant to send to the bakery lady in town, to post on her shop window. Need a cook, 3 meals a week. Not much pay, but it's warm. House has a dog, no small talk. He hadn't sent it. Still thought he didn't need it yet. But now, staring at the cold beans and coffee gone gray, Marshall knew, sooner or later, someone would come knocking. He just didn't know. When it happened, would he answer with his hands or with his heart? That evening in Hollow Rock, no one came. Only the wind. And the wind doesn't knock. It just passes through and leaves a sigh on the old shutters. Nevada, late autumn afternoon. The sky had faded from blue, and red dust coated every step of the rotting porch boards. Some meetings don't arrive with a call, but with a soft knock, just loud enough for those who've endured the most to know they're still capable of being heard. The last light of the day stretched thin, like honey spilling slow across the cracked earth. The sun had fallen behind the western ridge, leaving a smear of red along the horizon, and the fine dust in the air seemed to hang suspended, caught between day and night, unsure whether to vanish or settle into memory. A small handcart carrying 2 souls stopped before the sagging gate of Hollow Rock Ranch. There were no horses, no echoing hoofbeats, just a pair of worn shoes, dusted and rust red, halting at steps that looked like they'd been swept in a hurry. Ellie Thorne stood there, her silhouette etched against the slanted light like a carving on weathered stone. She wore nothing fancy, just a brown dress, frayed at the sleeves, the hem patched with mismatched thread. Her hair was tied back at the nape, though strands had come loose and clung to her neck where sweat had dried. In her left hand she held a sack of cornmeal bound with twine. In her right, a wooden spoon, its handle scorched and blackened, a thing most folks wouldn't notice, yet likely the last remnant of fires she'd once tended. Behind her skirt stood a child, Tommy, about 6. He carried nothing but a coarse cloth bag, one side puffed from a torn book, and an old wooden horse tucked inside. His eyes held a wary stillness, part hidden, part searching. Not fearful, but not trusting either. The wind tousled his curls across his brow, like a curtain guarding what he wouldn't yet say. Ellie paused beneath the porch awning. She scanned the space. A chair askew by the door, a tin basin flecked with ash, and a man's boot prints freshly imprinted in the dust. She didn't knock right away. She just stood, as if taking a full breath before confirming she still had enough resolve not to turn away. Then she lifted her hand. Not high, not hard. Just 3 quiet taps, enough to stir something deep inside the old wood, like waking a house that had slept too long. Tommy clung to her skirt, his small fingers gripping, releasing, gripping again, like the silent rhythm of a breath held tight. The door opened after a pause that wasn't rushed, yet didn't delay. The light inside was faint, just a flicker from a far-off stove flame casting the shadow of a tall man, shoulders stooped as if shaped more by wind than by words. His gaze settled on Ellie, drifted to her hands, the sack, the spoon, then to the boy. No one spoke. No one offered a greeting. There was no "sorry to keep you waiting," no "who are you?" Only stillness, long enough for someone with judgment to build a wall, and for someone with grit to step through it unflinching. Ellie dipped her head. Not quite a bow, more the reflex of someone who's learned that looking directly often isn't welcome. She said, "I heard you needed a cook." Her voice wasn't loud, but it held. It wasn't soft like a beggar's plea, nor sharp like someone used to rejection. It was the sound of a spoon stirring a pot, steady, warming, if one had the patience to listen. The wind moved between them. On one side, a man who believed he had no room left in the house for anyone else. On the other, a woman who had nowhere else to call home. Tommy peeked out from behind his mother's dress, his eyes catching the man's. No one smiled. No one spoke. But the silence wasn't refusal. It was the middle place between consideration and consent. As if the wind, after seasons of passing through, had paused just long enough to hear who stood on the porch. Marshall didn't invite them in, nor did he stop them. He only stepped back half a pace, hand still on the door. His shadow stretched across the floor, cutting through the soft light behind him, like a wordless warning. No one's waiting in here. But no one's keeping you out, either. Ellie set the sack down on the porch, adjusting the tie. She turned to Tommy and nodded gently. The boy stepped inside first, still holding her skirt's edge. Ellie followed. The door closed behind them with a creak, dry, aged, but not forbidding. The wind still moved outside. But with the door shut, it no longer rattled the shutters the way it used to. That was the evening when the stove hadn't yet caught fire, but someone was already standing near it. No one knew how long that presence would remain. But one thing was certain. For the first time in many months, someone had looked at the skillet hanging silent in the kitchen. In a place where the threshold bore neither invitation nor refusal, a person could still step through, if weariness ran deep enough, and their hands still knew how to carry kindness gently. The door closed behind Ellie with a soft hinge creak, not the sound of welcome, nor denial. It was more like a breath held too long, part release, part restraint. The house swallowed them in its amber light. Not quite dark, but dim enough that every object inside seemed dusted by time itself, not hidden, not pretending to still belong to the living. Tommy entered first, his steps slowing after only 2 paces. He stopped at the edge of an old rug, where the fabric had faded in the center from being walked across too many times. He didn't speak. His eyes landed on the hearth, where only cold ash remained, and a few unburnt chunks of coal. No fire. Just a rusted fire iron, resting off-center as though someone had recently touched it, and then forgotten to set it back. Ellie stood behind her boy. She didn't remove her shawl. Her eyes swept the room, a greasy stove shelf, a wooden table scarred by what looked more like a hatchet than a kitchen knife, and a cast-iron skillet hanging from a rusty nail, round, black, no longer glossy. She caught a glimpse of herself in its dull curve, blurred, distorted, but still recognizably human. Marshall said nothing from behind the door. He stood to the side, one hand resting on the wooden frame, his gaze landing on Tommy, but not lingering. It touched the boy and then pulled away, as if too long a look might summon a memory neither of them wanted called back. The floor bore prints of dried mud and soot, fresh, the boot tread still sharp. Beneath Tommy's feet, the dust remained undisturbed. The boy seemed to notice this too, and moved carefully, as if afraid to stir what little still remained of something once important. Ellie bent down and set the sack of cornmeal near the table leg. The sound was barely audible, just the twine tapping the wood and a faint echo like someone calling from very far off. She removed her shawl, folded it, and laid it over the chair. In her hand, the wooden spoon remained, its handle the only thing catching light in the dust-thick room. She looked around, then, by instinct rather than permission, walked toward the hanging skillet. She took it down, holding it with the care of someone lifting a hand fever-warm from sickness. With the edge of her sleeve she wiped once, then again, not to clean, just to touch, as if saying to its past, "I won't replace you, but if needed, I'll keep you from rusting further." Marshall glanced over his shoulder and saw Ellie at the skillet. He didn't stop her, nor did he seem surprised. He wasn't used to someone in his kitchen. Then again, he couldn't remember the last thing he'd cooked. Tommy was still fixed on the hearth. He knelt, fingers brushing the brick at the base, then quickly pulling back. Not from fear, but from uncertainty. Unsure if that gesture would be wrong in a place that wasn't his. He looked at his mother. Ellie gave him a slow nod, her gaze softening. Marshall noticed. A mother's way of reminding her child that no matter how many strange houses he stepped into, if she was still there, then he still had somewhere to lean. In the kitchen, the dim glow of the oil lamp cast 3 shadows onto the wall. No one stood close. No one touched. But their presence had begun something. Not change, but the hairline crack of a wall that had hardened over too many years. The room no longer sat entirely still. There was the sound of fabric brushing wood, the groan of metal on nail as Ellie rehung the skillet, the steady breathing of a boy imagining fire from ash. Buck, the old dog, raised his head from his straw mat near the back door. His eyes opened halfway, then closed again, as if recognizing someone new, but finding no reason to bark. To him, Marshall's footfalls were still the only ones worth noting. Ellie said nothing more. She rolled up her sleeves and loosely tied them behind her back, then began clearing the table. Not hurried, not hesitant. Just enough to let the man of the house know. There was now another hand here. And that hand did not disrupt, nor alter. It simply refused to let dust settle deeper than it already had. Tommy eventually looked away from the hearth. He sat, watching his mother. His eyes didn't light up, but they didn't dim either. They simply lived. That was the first evening, when, in a house long filled with wind and silence, came the faint sound of hands brushing wood, of unfamiliar feet on a dusty floor, and a worn skillet being wiped clean by the sleeve of a stranger. As if the past had just been gently dusted aside to make room for something not yet named. The first evening at Hollow Rock. In a kitchen once frozen by cold ash and the routines of solitude, a stranger's hand was rekindling the fire. No words were spoken, but existence, sometimes, asks for nothing more than being touched in ways that do no harm. Ellie lit the stove using old wood. She didn't rush, didn't fumble like someone trying to impress. The flame rose quietly. No crackling, no fanfare. Just a slow, uneven glow of red and yellow, reflecting off the sun-worn skin of her cheek, as if the fire itself paused to listen to the hands that summoned it. In the cast-iron skillet she'd wiped clean earlier, she melted the last of the salted fat from a near-empty jar. The soft hiss of grease meeting iron was the first true sound from that corner of the kitchen in months. Low, steady, but not cold. Corn followed, poured in after onions, and a few torn scraps of smoked meat had browned. She didn't measure. Everything was poured by eye, stirred by hand, and seasoned with years spent cooking for people she didn't know, in places that never called themselves home. He didn't ask what she was cooking, didn't say what he wanted. But now and then his gaze tilted, less from suspicion, more like memory checking in, confirming that someone unfamiliar was present but hadn't rearranged anything sacred. Tommy sat on a chair near the stove, fingers curled around the edge of the table. He said nothing, but his legs swung just slightly, the rhythm matching almost perfectly with the ladle stirring in the pot. The firelight played across his face, not bright enough to banish old fears, but warm enough to keep a child seated without clutching his nightcloth. Ellie served the corn stew into 3 ceramic bowls, thick-rimmed, chipped, the kind used in mining camps where men ate fast and moved on. But tonight, no one was going anywhere, and the corn stew no longer carried the scent of sweat and soot. It steamed gently, fragrant with sweet onions and smoked meat soaked into soft kernels. She placed a bowl in front of Marshall. No bow of the head, no polite, "Please eat." Just the bowl, set down square, the spoon straightened, then Tommy's, then hers. Simple, exact. Ellie ate slowly. She didn't watch Marshall, but she noticed. He didn't put the spoon down halfway, didn't hesitate, didn't grimace. And that was how a man like him said, "It's good." Tommy kept his head low, a small spoon in hand. He ate slowly, carefully, not spilling a drop. His eyes locked onto the bowl, as if afraid it might vanish if he looked away. But by the 4th spoonful, he exhaled, shoulders eased, lips moved without tightness, and he kept eating, no longer needing to watch the room. The house gave off no sound beyond the groaning of wood under heat, the hush of a spoon stirring broth, and the whisper of wind slipping along the walls. But in that quiet, something shifted. Not loudly, not clearly, just the subtle crack of old ice, long frozen, beginning to fracture, enough for the fire to glimpse water underneath. As the meal drew to a close, Ellie moved to rise and clear the table, but Marshall did what no one expected. He took his own bowl to the basin, turned on the hand pump, and began to wash it. Ellie paused, her hand hovering near the edge of the table. She'd grown used to cleaning in silence, like a ghost without name. But now someone had done it first, not needing thanks, not asking to be noticed, just because it felt like something that should be done. Tommy leaned back in his chair, eyes drooping, arms around his full belly. The rough cloth he usually clutched at night lay forgotten at the foot of the chair. No one reminded him. He yawned softly, cheeks tinged pink from heat. The room still held little light, but one thing was sure. The boy was falling asleep without needing to guard himself. Ellie gently laid the cloth over her son's back. She said nothing, then turned to watch Marshall rinse the second bowl. Steam rose from the basin, warm and faintly fragrant with soap, threading into the air like something long familiar, but untouched for too long. It was the first meal. No one asked what it was. No one adjusted the salt. No one spoke of past lives or reached too far ahead. But in the sound of spoons against crockery, and in the firelight that caught the cheek of a sleeping child, something deeply human returned to a house that had once forgotten how to feel itself alive. Some bonds are not forged by words nor sealed by promises. They form simply because another day begins, and the people who could have left stayed, doing what is right, in silence. The next morning, the air was cold enough for breath to fog as it hit the yard. The sun had yet to rise fully, but a pale white light had begun brushing the tin roof of Hollow Rock Ranch. Dew clung to the eaves and fell in steady drops into the metal bucket beneath the porch. Tick, tick like a clock counting the time that was still theirs to live. Marshall opened the kitchen door, its hinge grating softly into the wind. Buck, the old dog, raised his head from his bedding. No one spoke. There was only a quiet glance exchanged between a man long used to solitude and a boy still learning how to stand beside someone. Tommy stood behind Marshall, no cloth in hand, no fists in pockets. Just a broom too tall for him by a hand's length, held firmly in both arms. No one told him to bring it. No one asked him to. Marshall gave him a glance, then stepped ahead. His feet paused for a beat on the threshold, not from surprise, but long enough for the boy to know, "You're allowed to follow." They crossed the yard, dew soaking into their soles, their footprints pressed deeper into the earth than yesterday. The chicken coop stood behind the hay barn, roof pitched, one corner peeled up from the last storm. Inside, the hens murmured lazily. Marshall unlatched the door, letting light spill across the dirt and straw floor. Tommy asked nothing. He swept. Slow, measured strokes. Marshall saw it. The way a boy worked not to please, but because something inside said it should be done. He said nothing, offered no correction, just moved to check the water pan, then lifted the feed sack to his shoulder. Back inside, Ellie folded the quilt she'd washed the day before. She smoothed every edge, folded it lengthwise, and placed it neatly on the chair beside the window. On the table, last night's dishes had been dried and stacked. A slice of fresh cornbread sat on a porcelain plate. Not by the fire, because this morning no one had said they were hungry. She wiped the table, each stroke of the cloth steady, like breathing. The rag was dampened with warm water, heated earlier, right when she'd noticed the teapot lid was cracked. She didn't fix the pot, but chose instead a ceramic cup to use, for now, without asking Marshall's leave. In an old house, some things will not break further, if you know how to touch them. Ellie opened a drawer to find a knife for the bread. She discovered a pair of scissors, wedged between jars of rusted nails. The blades were dulled, the hinge loose. She clicked them open once, then again, the sound like an object sighing after being forgotten. She didn't put them back, just wiped them gently with her undersleeve and set them beside the salt jar, as if to say, "I see you, and I won't replace you. I just want you to last a little longer." She poured warm water into a bowl, dipped a cloth, and wiped the windowsill. The wind crept through a crack in the wooden frame. She didn't seal it. She simply pulled a chair closer, so that if Tommy sat there later, he'd see the morning light sooner, clearer. When Marshall and Tommy returned, their boots were damp with earth. They didn't step in right away. Tommy set the broom on the step, then sat beside Buck and rested a hand on the dog's back. Buck, still half asleep, didn't move. The boy didn't pet him, didn't coo, just placed his hand there, as if to say, "I don't mind you being here, if you don't mind me." Marshall stepped into the house. The smell of warmed cornbread hung in the air, mild, comforting, just strong enough to remind an empty stomach it had needs. He passed the table, and his eyes caught the scissors, gleaming faintly from where they'd been cleaned. He stopped, picked them up, opened them. They still clicked, but smoother now. That breakfast, no one praised the bread. No one asked who did what. But the plate was left clean, And when Tommy stood from his chair, he looked back, not at his mother, but at the chair where Marshall always sat. Not waiting to be called, just making sure that today, too, the man would be there, and the table would still hold 3 bowls. No words of gratitude were spoken. But gratitude doesn't always need a name. It lives in the bread sliced with a sharpened blade, in the broom carried without being told, and in the quiet look of a child. Just enough for a grown man to know he is no longer alone when doing what's right. Some forms of contact don't come from intention, but from the reflexes of someone who's lived too long in silence, and, in a sudden moment, must hold on to someone else. Not out of logic, but from the deep-seated fear that they might not be able to save them a second time. That afternoon, the wind arrived earlier than usual. Since noon, the sky had worn an odd shade of blue, not clear, not gray, but deep like water just before it breaks. Thin layers of cloud drifted low across the mountain ridges, stretched like a woman clutching a shawl that still wasn't enough to keep her warm. On the tin roof of the main house, a wooden plank near the chimney had come loose. Each gust of wind lifted and dropped it with a soft, steady tap, like the anxious pulse of a house that hadn't known quiet sleep in a long while. Ellie heard it around midday. She looked up, said nothing. She dried her hands on her apron, tied a scarf around her head, and walked out back, toward the ladder leaning against the wall. Marshall was splitting wood near the chicken coop. He saw her cross the yard, a bundle of nails tucked in her apron, the head of a hammer held gently between her teeth. But he didn't ask. She placed the ladder, set it carefully against the eaves, and climbed, one step at a time, head bowed, hands steady. Her skirt was hitched above her knees, tied at the waist for ease. Underfoot, the tin roof was covered in soot and brittle leaves from a season gone untouched. The wind picked up as she stood atop the roof. The whole house seemed to tilt beneath her, not from imbalance, but because no one had stood up there in so long. She knelt, pulled a nail, and lifted the hammer. Her strokes were slow, deliberate, each one a silent vow. If I've stepped into this house, I won't let it fall further. Marshall looked up at the sound of hammering. He gripped the axe tighter, stepped once toward the ladder, then stopped. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't called. And he wasn't the kind to intervene unless asked. Ellie shifted, crawling slowly toward the far edge, where the plank had lifted most. She lowered herself to one knee, leaning forward to steady her balance. But something slid beneath her, a patch of soot, maybe a dry leaf, and in an instant, she lost footing. Her body tipped toward the edge like a cloth swept by sudden wind. No scream, just a breath swallowed hard into the chest. But Marshall was already there. He'd moved the moment the wind lifted her skirt clear of her ankles. His arm shot out faster than he thought his body still could. His hand caught her wrist, firm, unflinching, strong enough to hold, gentle enough not to hurt. Ellie dangled halfway off the roof. One leg still had purchase, the other had slipped clear. She gripped his arm with both hands, nails pressing into his skin, but neither of them felt pain. Wind whipped across their faces. Marshall's shirt billowed at the back. His forearm tensed, cords in his wrist stretched tight like rope lashed around a beam. She looked into his eyes, not searching for rescue, but caught, like someone discovered in the exact place they'd hoped never to be seen. They both breathed hard, but no words came. No "be careful," no "thank you." Just a stare, unflinching, unguarded. between two people who'd never trusted anyone to catch them, but now knew the other wouldn't let go. They held that position longer than needed, not because they wanted to, but because neither of them wanted to be the first to return to Earth. In that pause, it wasn't the roof that needed fixing. It was something inside each of them that had slipped out of place. Then a voice called up from the yard, a child's voice, small and unsure. "Mama, dinner's ready." Tommy stood by the backyard stove, arms wrapped around his belly, eyes tilted skyward like the sky itself might show him the way back to safety. Ellie blinked. Her breath stuttered. Marshall tensed, then gently pulled her back onto the roof. Only when her hands were firmly placed on the tin did he release her wrist, but his fingers lingered a moment longer than needed, just enough to feel her pulse. She stood upright, her skirt flapping to one side. He stepped back. No one spoke, but both knew there wouldn't need to be a second rescue, because next time, if someone climbed the roof, there'd be another holding the ladder below. They finished the last plank in silence. The wind kept blowing, sunlight angled low, cutting across her back as she drove in the final nail. When they climbed down, Marshall's boots hit the ground first. Ellie followed. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze held firm. The wind struck her cheek again, but this time she didn't flinch. Tommy ran up, handing his mother a small cloth. She wrapped it around her neck, eyes flicking back to the roof, where two footprints, one large and one small, were pressed into the dusty tin like the wind had tried to cut through, and someone had held it back. That evening, dinner was served earlier than usual. No one spoke of the roof. But when Ellie passed Marshall a bowl, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. Every old house has drawers no one opens anymore, floorboards no one steps across, places where the dead leave what they still meant to say, and the living haven't yet found the courage to listen. That morning, the rain didn't fall hard, just small, steady drops, falling long enough to dampen the tin roof, darken the porch steps, and let the scent of wet wood seep into every thread of clothing. Inside, the air felt like it had been poured from a watercolor painting, quiet, soft, tinged with gray. Ellie woke earlier than usual, partly because rain-shortened sleep is never deep, partly because the slow drip from the eaves sounded like someone tapping gently on the door of memory. She lit the stove, stirred up a simple cornmeal porridge with salt and butter, then left the pot to simmer low. When the bubbles began to rise, small, silent, she turned toward the low cupboard in the corner, where she hoped to find the sewing needle she'd misplaced days before. The drawer didn't open easily. Its handle was rusted, the paint chipped, the wood around the hinge swollen from years of moisture. She had to wrap her hand in cloth, tug gently a few times before it gave a reluctant creak, like the sigh of something untouched for too long. Beneath a dusty rag, there was only an empty-looking cavity. But deeper in, a small wooden box lay nestled against the back. Its corners were worn, the lid warped slightly with age and weather. Ellie lifted it carefully, like handling something that might still bruise if dropped. Dust didn't cover it thick, but enough to show no one had reached for it in years. Faint handwriting marked the top. M, for Marshall. The letters leaned slightly left, uneven, familiar. The script of a woman who likely wrote more with wet hands from gardening than with any pen. She opened the lid. A breath of old paper rose. Ink soaked deep into fibers, unread sentences, and silence folded so neatly it almost passed for grace. Inside were several letters, 4 or 5. Not many, bound together by a faded indigo thread. Ellie touched the edge of one. Her skin prickled, not from cold, but from the sensation of crossing a line someone once drew very clearly. She untied the thread, slowly, and pulled out a single sheet. No envelope. The ink had blurred in places. Rain, maybe, or tears, or time itself. But the words still held. Dearest Marshall, if you're reading this, it means I am likely gone. I wrote this the afternoon before the snow came. My hands already trembling. But there were still things I needed to say. Don't let this house become a place of walls without people. Don't let memory turn into something that locks the doors. We aren't meant to live with the wind forever, son. Ellie stopped at that line. She drew in a breath, not to hide her reaction, but to steady her hands. Still, they trembled, not because of the rain outside, but because it felt like a mother was speaking through a door left closed too long. Outside, the breeze whispered through the wallboards. A drop of water slipped from the roof and hit the cracked window pane, like someone tapping their finger, waiting for a reply. Ellie kept reading. I know you'll want to stay. This place holds what's left of your father, of you, of the years when no one had gone yet. But because of that, it can easily become a grave for things that deserve to live. Your kindness, that softness I saw in you when you tucked the blanket around Buck, and the smile I'm not sure yet you know you still carry. If someone knocks at the door, don't be too quick to doubt. Sometimes they're not looking for shelter, only holding on to enough hope to believe there's still someone inside to open it. At that, Ellie let go of the page. Gently. It slipped into her lap, and she sat there a long while. The firelight from the distant stove framed her through the doorway. A still figure, head slightly bowed, as if listening to something never said aloud, but somehow understood better than anything ever spoken. Later, she folded the letter again, carefully, like folding a shirt for someone still living. She tied the thread once more, pausing slightly as she slipped the knot, as if afraid too tight a binding might smother the words inside. She placed it back in the box, closed the lid. The fire was still glowing. The porridge was still warm. And outside the rain kept falling, soft, steady, like the footfall of memory returning, not to question, only to be present. That evening, the rain had ended by midday, but the air still held a damp hush. A thin mist stretched across the kitchen window, like breath pressed slow against glass. The fire had been lit again since early afternoon, and the house warmed gradually, like a blanket waiting to be touched. Marshall returned from the shed, arms cradling a bundle of newly dried wood, the scent of pine resin still clinging faint. He didn't rush. His boots didn't stomp. But the door opened right as Ellie heard him. The creak of boards on the porch, the hush of cloth brushing wind, the kind of quiet weight carried only by people who've lived too long alone. She was at the stove, her skirt grazing her calves, one hand steadying the pot handle, the other stirring cornmeal into even circles. Her shoulders leaned slightly forward, a shape that belonged there, as if this kitchen had been waiting for someone shaped just like her on a night just like this. She didn't turn when he entered. She didn't need to ask who it was. Because the warmth of a home isn't made by people asking your name. It's made when they come in and don't walk past you. Tommy was already seated at the table, his feet not yet touching the ground, but his eyes lit faintly when he saw Marshall step in. The boy said nothing, but tilted his head when he noticed the firewood being stacked into a triangle near the stove, the same way his mother used to do it, but now done by a man who once wouldn't look at him for more than a breath. Marshall set the wood down and paused. He looked toward the table. 3 bowls, 2 spoons, and a neatly folded cloth at the center. Just that. But the difference wasn't in the number. It was in the way the third chair, once always angled slightly away, was now pulled closer, its back tilted gently toward the table, as if bowing to a presence that didn't need to be announced. Ellie broke the first piece of cornbread in half, placed it on a stoneware plate, and gently set it before Tommy. She didn't ask if he was hungry. She didn't check the hour. Because there are days not lived by clocks, but by the way someone places something warm in front of you without needing to ask. Marshall washed his hands at the basin near the window, dried them with a coarse cloth, and stepped toward the table. He didn't wait to be invited. He didn't barge in either. He simply walked forward, like a man who knew the path, and pulled out the chair. It didn't scrape. The house had already gotten used to him doing that. Ellie sat last. As she did, the hem of her skirt brushed Marshall's leg. No one shifted. No one looked up. But as they both leaned forward to peel the final layer of a red onion, their hands touched. Not firm, not on purpose, but enough that neither pulled away. Her fingers, calloused and warm, his, rough, thick, but not unkind. Tommy watched from across the table. He didn't say a word, but he picked up the third spoon, the one that lay between them, and placed it in the center of the table, not handing it to anyone, not keeping it for himself, just setting it there, as if to say, "This is for the one who stays." The wind slipped through the back door seam. The oil lamp cast a golden glow across Ellie's cheek, lit the edge of Marshall's hair, and sent their 3 shadows stretching across the kitchen wall, not apart, but together, as though the house, too, had stopped feeling alone. Marshall looked toward Tommy. His gaze no longer held doubt, no distance, just recognition that some things don't come by blood, but by staying long enough to let someone else build a fire for you. Ellie glanced at Marshall. He was brushing a few crumbs off Tommy's plate with his thumb, a gesture with no weight, no design, but one Ellie had never expected from a man like him, or thought he'd let anyone witness. The evening passed that way, not in silence but in quiet that knew how to speak. And when the bowls were rinsed, when the lamp was turned down, when one shadow folded clothes by the fire and another restacked the wood just so, then everything, without being named, was understood. They had answered one another, not with words, but by staying. Outside, the air turned cold again. But inside the little kitchen, 3 breaths slowly warmed the space, as if this roof had finally remembered how to hold people in, simply by no longer letting anyone be left outside. Not everyone who knocks is someone you're waiting for. Some shadows don't come walking out of the sunset, but crawl out from years long buried, years folks thought were laid to rest with a hungry winter or a goodbye that never found its words. But when that shadow returns, it ain't the sound of gunfire that makes a man reconsider. It's the way another man stands in the doorway, still and unmoving, that makes all the difference. That morning wasn't colder than most, but the wind blew the wrong way. Birds kept clear of the henhouse, and the old horse pawed nervously at the fence post, hooves tapping like it knew something was off. Tommy was crouched low, carving letters into a small piece of wood, something he called a door for the baby chicks. When Ellie stepped out of the house with a laundry basket in hand, the hem of her dress caught on the dry grass still clinging to the earth, not yet swept away. She meant to tell Tommy not to use a chipped blade, but then she saw the figure coming down the trail. A man on horseback, back straight, chest broad, beneath a still-creased brown duster. Black leather boots polished to a mirror, saddle freshly oiled, and the reek of cheap tobacco catching a ride on the wind like an unwelcome greeting. Ellie didn't ask, didn't call for anyone. She just set the basket down and walked toward Tommy, placing herself between the boy and the stranger, like her silence alone could be a fence. The man stopped a few paces away, brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve, then pulled out a folded stack of papers, creased at the corners, but bearing a fresh red seal. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough not to need repeating. "I'm the boy's father's cousin. His mother's passed. His daddy's been buried 4 seasons now. I came to bring him where he belongs." Ellie didn't blink, didn't look at the paper. She only tilted her body slightly, one hand settling on Tommy's shoulder, just as the boy clutched at her dress, like he didn't need to understand the words to know they spelled trouble. "I didn't ask who you are," Ellie said, voice no louder than the wind. "I just know. He ain't going anywhere." The man smirked, the kind of grin that leaned on the law like it was a sure bet. He held the paper out, as if the seal carried more weight than anything human ever could. "Got papers, got custody, got a witness from the county if you need one." And just then, a sound came from the barn. Not a knock exactly, but the scrape of a latch, the creak of old hinges, and footsteps that fell slow but steady. No one turned, but everyone knew who it was. Marshall didn't come out wearing a gun. No coat slung over his shoulder, just a faded work shirt, sleeves dusted in sawdust. He didn't look at the paper, didn't look at the man. He looked at Ellie, looked at Tommy, then stepped forward, quiet, steady, like a beam driven into the heart of a house. "You've got papers," Marshall said, voice just enough to beat the wind. "I've got this home, and in this home, no one gets thrown out." The man frowned, like he couldn't understand why no one was arguing. He stomped his boot, held the paper higher, this time angled toward Marshall, like daring the man to believe in ink more than blood. "Law's law. I didn't come asking permission. I came to do my duty as next of kin." "Then go ahead," Marshall replied. "But if you think tearing a child away from the only warmth he's found is what family means, maybe it's time you looked up that word again." Tommy trembled. Ellie leaned down, rubbing his back in slow circles. Marshall didn't touch either of them. But he stepped forward, just half a stride, placing himself squarely between them and the man. No threat. No show. Just a man drawing the line between wilderness and tilled soil. The wind blew through, lifting the paper in the stranger's hand like it didn't want to stay. No one said anything. But the silence dragged out long enough that even a man on horseback could feel it, like being stared through, not by eyes, but by a welcome that had never been offered. He folded the paper, muttered something that didn't reach past his lips. "I'll come back. With the county boys." "Then bring wood," Marshall said. "You'll find this place well guarded, and nobody's leaving. Not because they can't, because they finally don't want to." The man turned his horse, His face wasn't red, but he didn't sit quite as tall on his ride anymore. Dust clung to his polished boots, and his proud figure shrank against the red clay and sky. Finally, only hoofbeats were left behind, and then not even that. Marshall didn't speak again, just turned to Ellie, and their eyes met without a single word. But in that look, there was agreement. This house wasn't a home because of the walls. It was because it refused to let go of the ones who dared to stay. Tommy looked up, and for the first time in many weeks, he reached for both hands, one to his mother, the other to the man who didn't need blood to be called father. And in the fading light of that quiet afternoon, the little house, without a gate, without a gun, without a flag, became a fortress. Not through declarations, but through the simple act of staying and standing and saying, "This is enough." That morning cut through like a blade, the kind of cold that slipped past skin not to wound, but to see if anything inside a man hadn't frozen solid yet. Marshall layered his coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and mounted his horse without a word to anyone. Ellie was rinsing a bundle of mustard greens out back. She looked up for just a breath, but didn't ask where he was headed. She didn't need to. Because a man like that only left when carrying something important, and only came back when he brought something or important still. The town wasn't busy that morning. Signs creaked overhead in the wind, metal chains clinking against wood, creating that peculiar sound of a place that had never been truly warm, but wasn't cold enough to forget. The horse came to a stop in front of a squat roofed house. Gray brick, a faded blue door, and a small plaque above it. T.A. Beckett, retired lawman, legal advisor for pensions and unasked questions. Marshall knocked. A slow, dragging step echoed inside. Then the door opened, revealing an old man, hunched but wiry, with eyes still sharp like lanterns kept full and trimmed. "Marshall Haynes," said Beckett Schult, without asking why he'd come. "I've held on to this for 15 years, thinking no one would ever come for it. Seems I was wrong." Inside, the office held little more than 2 chairs and a scarred wooden desk. Everything had grown worn, save for the bottom drawer, where Beckett pulled out a leather-bound folder soft with age. He opened it without flipping through, just reached for what mattered. "You don't need to marry nobody if you don't want to." But in this state, back in 1874, they passed a clause meant to protect those no one else would. If you sign, that boy gets a name, gets rights, and no one can lay claim to him, not when the paper's clear. Marshall looked down at the page. It didn't say much, but each word carried more weight than the wind knocking outside. Beckett continued, "All it needs is for you to state, cohabiting and jointly responsible since the date of, and sign. No license. No witnesses, just a quiet enough heart to know you won't go back on it." Marshall wasn't a man for words. His wrist locked up every time he held a pen, but not this time. He reached for the silver-nibbed fountain pen, dipped it in ink, then wrote. Slow, deliberate, no flourish, no hesitation. The first thing he wrote was her name, Eleanor Grace Whitlow. The last was his, Marshall T. Haynes. No curlicues, no grace notes, just one straight line, like the road that led home, where someone was fixing lunch with onions and cornmeal. Beckett nodded. He didn't say nice work, just pressed the seal down, lightly, as if even the stamp understood it was anchoring something not meant to be undone. "The boy's under your name now," She's under the law's protection. If anyone comes asking, hand them this copy." He slid the fresh sheet across the table. "But if they still don't believe, just point toward that house and say, 'I live there.' That'll be enough." Marshall rose, dipped his head in thanks. As Beckett walked him to the door, the old man rested a hand on his shoulder, thin but steady, and said quietly, "You don't need to know the law, son, just how to keep your word." On the way home, snow began to fall, just enough to lay a cotton-soft blanket across his shoulders, muting the old mud stains still clinging to his boots. He didn't push the horse, let it walk easy, as though he wanted to memorize each hill, each tree, like a vow that this path would never be walked alone again. As he neared the house, smoke curled from the chimney, slanting with the breeze. There was a scent on the air, cornmeal, smoked meat, and something else. A meal made not out of duty, but from remembrance. Tommy was herding the chickens in. Ellie stood on the porch, drying a bowl with careful hands, a habit no one told her to keep. When she saw him, she didn't speak, just set the bowl down and opened the door. On the table there was one more place set, its cushion thicker than the rest. Marshall shrugged off his coat, brushed the snow free, and placed the folded paper carefully into the drawer near the hearth. Ellie looked at him. She didn't touch the paper, didn't ask, "What is this?" She simply nodded and ladled another spoonful of soup. In a world where seals were often used to take, some men still used them to protect. Not everyone gets their name written into another's paper, but when someone does it for you, it usually means they don't plan on leaving. The light had started to slant westward when the first wagon rolled over the hardened earth in front of Marshall's fence. It was an old buggy, light brown, worn but clean. A man stepped down, coat brushing his boots, gloves removed carefully and tucked into an inside pocket. Behind him came a state officer in uniform, moving without hurry, but his gaze scanned every roof edge and gate latch like he was measuring if this place could rightly hold a child. Marshall was already on the porch, shoulder turned slightly, hands still streaked with soil from planting potatoes. He didn't speak, didn't offer a welcome. Ellie stepped out from the kitchen, her dress still carrying the scent of fresh-baked bread, hair pinned up as if she'd known someone was coming, without needing to be told. Tommy stood close behind her leg, holding a sprig of rabbit grass, not crying, not questioning. He'd seen folks come before, but never this many. Because this time, it wasn't just two men. Down the main road came three more. Mr. Harris, the town blacksmith, limping, but his hands still steady like the hammer he swung. Miss Clara, the schoolteacher, with a basket of still warm bread in her arms. And Mrs. Mildred, the widow from beside the general store. Her usual frown softened, her dress pressed neat. No one had been invited, but every one of them had a reason to show up. The officer looked surprised. The other man didn't bother hiding his irritation. He spoke of notarized documents, of legal guardianship, and of a blood relative robbed by strangers with no true claim. Mr. Harris raised a hand. Blood don't raise a child, not without heart. And this family's been raising him with something you can't carry in a briefcase. Warm breakfasts and blankets washed every week. Miss Clara followed, her voice gentle but firm. I taught that boy to write his name. He's never once misspelled Haynes. You might have paper, but that name, he chose to write it. Mrs. Mildred cleared her throat, then spoke, almost as if she surprised even herself. I've lived near this house 40 years. Never seen one with its porch light on so early, so often. That woman gets up before the frost, sweeps her steps, and leaves a basket of eggs at my door every Thursday. You don't need to ask anything else. The officer turned to the town's legal man, Mr. Beckett. The old lawyer opened his worn case, pulled out a well-kept folder. Marshall T. Haynes, Beckett said, filed legal guardianship under Clause 227, revised 1874. Signed by City Council, stamped in red. He held the papers out, not thrusting them forward, not wielding them like a weapon, just placing truth where everyone could see it. The man grabbed the documents, eyes scanning tight, his lips pressed into a hard line, but he said nothing. He turned, climbed back into his wagon. Tommy watched him go, didn't cry. Ellie barely raised her eyes. She simply bent down and retied her son's bootlaces. Marshall remained still, hands folded behind him. A breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of roasted cornmeal and warm steam from the still open kitchen door. Even after the wheels disappeared down the trail, the small crowd didn't leave. Not from curiosity, but because they knew some things had to be witnessed to be fully believed. Without it, the telling would always fall short. Mr. Harris placed a crate of eggs on the porch. For tomorrow's breakfast. My hens were early today. Miss Clara handed Ellie her basket. Baked this morning, still warm. I tucked in some soft cheese, too. Mrs. Mildred said only one thing as she turned away. If you ever need tablecloths, I've kept a few from my husband's day. No one said goodbye, but each left something behind. Marshall bowed his head. Then, for the first time, he said it aloud. Thank you for coming. Ellie's hand brushed softly against his back. Tommy looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that tilted toward the lantern someone had just rehung by the door. When they went inside, the kitchen seemed a touch brighter, not from firelight, but from something newly set down in the hearts of those gathered there. Something no one named, but everyone carried home with them, like the warmth of bread still clinging to a coat sleeve, or the sound of footsteps that didn't turn back when hardship knocked. Not every town remembers how to hold on to good folks, but sometimes it only takes a meal shared, a child's name spoken right, and a house left unlocked, to remind a whole community that their heart's still beating. There are words no one needs to say, because a hand has already said them. That night, the moon hung round and silver, polished like an old coin burnished by quiet winds. The sky was cloudless. Stars sat still, the way elders do when they no longer need to prove anything. The earth had cooled. Night's chill seeped into the wooden walls, settled into every groove of the porch floorboards. The old dog lay beneath the bench, breathing slow and steady, each exhale its own kind of assurance that no one needed to keep watch anymore. Only the faint creak of the clothesline, where 3 handkerchiefs swayed in the moonlight. One pale beige, one washed-out blue, and one stitched clumsily with the shape of a rooster. Marshall adjusted the 3 chairs, not to tidy them, but to face them all toward the open fields beyond the pine line. He set his own first, angling it to block the wind for the other 2. The second chair Ellie took, drawing a thin quilt over her shoulders, then gently settling Tommy on her lap. The boy had fallen asleep when the sky still held its last blush of gold. Now he rested as if his body had grown used to being held, his head tilted to the left, mouth slightly open like he was whispering a dream. His fingers clung to the hem of his mother's blouse, something no one taught him, yet he did every time. Marshall sat last. No creak of wood, no words exchanged. But when Ellie's shoulder leaned into his, without hesitation, without being asked, he didn't turn. He just stayed, legs wide, hands resting on his thighs, while the breeze carried the faint scent of cornbread from the kitchen out to the porch. Inside, the fire still glowed. The cast-iron pot hadn't been washed. A bit of cornmeal mush and some scraps of sweet potato clung to the bottom. A silver spoon lay tipped on the rim, and then quietly, it slid down with the softest clink, just enough to touch something inside you. Ellie heard it, but didn't move. Marshall heard it too, but didn't rise. No one felt the need to do anything, because there was nothing left unattended anymore. The wind passed through the yard as if careful not to intrude. It tugged at the edge of the blanket, brushed across Tommy's cheek, tangled briefly in Ellie's hair, then slipped beneath Marshall's collar. It left behind nothing but the scent of dry wood and faint bacon grease. Somewhere distant, an owl called, not a warning, just another beat in the wordless rhythm of night. Marshall shifted, his shoulder moving slightly so Ellie could rest easier. No one spoke of it. But Ellie smiled, a smile so small only the fabric of his shirt could feel it. The old dog sighed contentedly, then snored again. Out in the field, fireflies blinked on, their short glimmers like late arrivals whispering good night. There were no visitors now, only 3 souls and a graying dog. Yet the house no longer felt like 4 walls. It was a living thing, with breath, with warmth, with people who stayed. Near midnight, Marshall rose. He didn't wake the boy. He bent low and lifted Tommy from Ellie's lap as if he'd done it 100 times before. Ellie stood too, gently wrapping the blanket tighter, one hand on Marshall's back as if to say, "It's me." But he didn't. They walked inside together, neither leading, neither behind. On the clothesline, the handkerchiefs still swayed. The full moon poured down like honey over rough wood, over a door not fully shut, and over 3 shadows, slowly becoming one. They didn't need to call it family. They didn't need to buck of what had been lost. One night like this was enough to make no one want to leave again. Marshall never said, "I love you." Ellie never asked, "What are we?" But they stayed. They didn't leave. And the child who once clung to his mother's dress now writes in his very first notebook. They don't say they love each other, but they do it with their hands. If this story made your heart pause for just a breath, drop a comment below. It doesn't have to be long. Just let it be real. Tap like if you still believe that kindness often arrives long after the hurt. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Echoes, a place where hearts once left behind finally find a home of their own. Do you still believe in quiet, unspoken love? We still do. What about you?